Composed Perception, Landscape as Aesthetic Process. Selections from the Comer Collection, University of Texas at Dallas, with special thanks to exhibit sponsors Jerry and Marilyn Comer, the collection director Dr. Diane Durant, the Spin Gallery, and the School of Arts and Humanities at UTD. This is a presentation by Amanda Dunbar, PhD candidate, University of Texas at Dallas, 2022. In his text, Landscape and Power, W.J.T. Mitchell writes, "Landscape, whether urban or rural, artificial or natural, always greets us as space, as environment, as that within which we, figured as the figures in the landscape, find or lose ourselves." End quote. Indeed, Mitchell urges the term landscape best be expressed as a verb, to landscape, as a reminder of how human agency imposes a particular order upon the natural environment. The word landscape underscores the social uses and transformation of space into place through some level of human cultivation. Following such an insight, this selection of works from the Comer Collection aims to explore landscape as a cultural practice and as an aesthetic process, exploring not what landscape is or means, but what it does, how it works, and how the human being crucially shapes and is shaped by this cultivation. As a medium that bears a particular element of documentary, quote, reality and, quote, unmediated truth, whether this is truly the case or not, photography often offers itself as a substitute for a direct human encounter. These contemporary landscape photographs explore not only how the human being cultivates the environment, what the environment in turn does to the human being, but how we naturalize such a phenomenon and how landscape as a verb comes to manifest specifically in photographic representation. In other words, what I wish to explore through this collection is how we shape landscape and how we become shaped by it, and how this reciprocal relationship has become so second nature to us that when we look at images of nature, we do not even consider how specific and strange a phenomenon it really is. Here, Joel Salcido's Tangerines on Blue, Lee River, China, 2011, offers a microcosm for much of the rest of the show. What exactly are we looking at? And how does the frame inform how we read the photograph? How does this image alternate between still life and landscape? Are we looking at a mirror? Are we looking through a window pane? Or is this a composite image entirely? These are some of the questions that I wish for us to keep in mind as we move through the rest of the show. Landscape as a genre does not escape artistic processing and offers perhaps one of the most enigmatic relationships of the human being to the world in which they abide. Indeed, as a deeply established category of pictorial convention, we rarely consider the relationship between the artist and the beholder to the aesthetically processed land as one mediated by a long and intense tradition. When we designate natural scenery as, quote, landscape, we are not using an innocent term, but rather a visual metaphor formed by the pictorial conventions associated with the original landscape as picture. Landscape, even the photographic landscape, ties intimately to painting convention and demonstrates the pivotal role of representation and how the words landscape and image are inseparable terms. Vittoria De Palma in 2016 writes, "Landscape never exists independent of representation. Without image, there is no such thing as landscape, only unmediated environment." End quote. Veritably, Landscape refers simultaneously to a view or delimited area of ground and its representation. The oscillation, ambivalence, and overlap between land, understood as an actual view, and its representation becomes fundamental to both the theoretical richness of the term and the variety of possibilities such a term offers. Figuring first as a genre of painting and as a mode of human subjectivity, landscape features a long tradition that has been well documented by such eminent art historians as Ernst Gombrich and cultural geographers as Dennis Cosgrove. In her text, Land Matters, 2011, Liz Wells explains, quote, "Landscape is a social product. Particular landscapes tell us something about cultural histories and attitudes. Landscape results from human intervention to shape or transform natural phenomena, of which we are simultaneously a part." End quote. The human being forms landscape as much as she is formed by it. While this is a show of contemporary photography, a brief review of the classical composition of, quote, landscape as painting bears discussion. Here, I introduce a, quote, classical landscape as painted by 17th century painter Claude Lorraine, who, in many ways, exemplifies the type of basic understanding of landscape we commonly understand. Here, we see a classical aesthetic or picturesque view to landscape art by emphasizing a clear fore, middle, and background, and crucially, we as viewers are placed as purveyors of the scene. The environment does not present itself as challenging or threatening. Rather, this pastoral scene allows for its consumption as if we are masters of the space, in terms both of its cultivation as a garden space and in the ease in which we might enter and abide in it as viewers. Perhaps more than any other image category, what defines, quote, landscape for the viewer becomes the frame, the confines of the image, which indicates what does and does not belong. Literally and figuratively, the frame limits the landscape, both in the sense of determining its outer boundary and in the sense that the frame constitutes the landscape. Without the frame, the space remains an undelimited expanse. The landscape may also be internally focused and organized by its relation to, quote, non-landscape, generally the human figure. Mark Kletz's gelatin silver print, Standing Before the Solitario Mountains, Fresno City, Texas, offers one clear example that both documents the intervention of the human figure upon the environment, while highlighting the boundary of the frame, and draws a clear distinction between landscape and non-landscape. In Kletz's image, the frame does not act as an amputation of a larger, more complete scene. Rather, the framing suggests a way of seeing the human figure as an integral, although only transitory, element of the natural landscape, examining the way people have occupied and experienced this land while limiting the evidence of their presence. In keeping with Mitchell's imperative to think of landscape as verb, Kletz's photograph, quote, landscapes the Solitario Mountains by transforming the vast uninhabited space to an accessible and graspable place, while simultaneously figuring the human agency that creates image. Further, the cast shadow of the photographic apparatus connects to the shadow of the human figure, its scale featuring as prominently as the human who wields it, adding yet another dimension to the separation of land and human being, while also crucially noting the mechanical process that records this interaction. While the photographs I show here are not part of the show currently on view, it bears noting that Klett follows in a tradition that includes such 19th century photographers as William Henry Jackson, whose photographs in the 1880s of the Grand Canyon and the American West pointedly include the makers of the images, albeit dwarfed or silhouetted by vast expanses of rugged nature. In these photographs, like Klett's Solitario Mountains, the viewer becomes aware that the pictures themselves result from a complex commingling of technological factors, specific narratives, intellectual aspirations, symbolism, and aesthetic composition. In their particular cropping, the place of the human being within the scope of the environment offers a specific commentary on where, or if, we belong, while also consciously documenting the aesthetic process of photographic landscaping itself. Such a photograph reminds the viewer that their place in front of the image has been mediated by the camera, the photographer, and questions what they bring to understanding place, nature, environment, and belonging. The bounds of an image can prove fundamental to the way we come to read a photographic landscape. In John Fowles' Bethlehem No. 25, the image omits the human figure and the larger scope of the referent, ostensibly the town of Bethlehem, but also the ground upon which we might orient ourselves. However, the traces of human intervention become evident, even while lacking the inclusion of an explicit human figure. Fowles' engagingly complex framing of the noxious clouds of emissions that reflect warm, ambient light offer an ambiguous commentary on human interventions on the land. Fowles' work features several collections that have dealt expressly with power plants, both nuclear and coal, focusing on their environmental impact, though always with an eye towards an enigmatic beauty that enthralls even while it threatens. Fowles' photographs of smoke clouds follow in the pictorialist tradition whose imaging of mists, fogs, and clouds offered a means to rescue, quote, aesthetic considerations of photography from, quote, mere mechanical documentation by modeling mediations on those of nature, while making commentary on the rapidly changing urban landscape. Here again, I offer a historical comparison to earlier photographs that are not part of this show that offer tantalizing precedents to Fowles' imagery. Alvin Langdon Coburn was an early 20th century photographer who became a key figure in the development of American pictorialism. He became the first major photographer to emphasize the visual potential of elevated viewpoints, and later made some of the first completely abstract photographs. In Fowles' photograph, the erect smokestacks of human industry act as a surrogate for the human figure, while the gaseous byproduct of refining power fill the bound space in much the same way as a cloudscape painted by J.M.W. Turner's paintbrush. Such a landscape, in our contemporary view, offers perhaps foremost a pointed statement about the environmental impact of industrialization, but does so while consciously adhering to romantic ideals of the picturesque or sublime. The cloudscape offers a particular human, or non-human, perspective that fuels our reading of the environment. It destabilizes the notion of a fixed, stable arrangement of natural forms ordered at some distance, both literally in the sense of a studio, this is a photograph taken in nature, and figuratively in terms of a fixed, grounded viewpoint and an adherence to a Claudian landscape composition. Fall's industrial cloudscape pays homage to late 19th century artists who idealized traditional rural life through modern and largely industrial means. This idealization, however, does not entirely disguise the aesthetics of sublime melancholy. Fall's landscape acknowledges that photographs of human industry are often coupled with environmental destruction, while remaining alluring and almost transcendental of their subject. In keeping with the painterly tradition that informs these photographs, we might also consider a parallel to Claude Monet's Gare Saint-Lazare series of 1877, which prominently features the sublime steam of the new locomotives as a harbinger of human industry, change, while also hinting at the anxiety of increasing urbanization and the loss of direct encounters with nature. Both Klett and Fall's photographs offer intimate engagements with environment that sustain a modified language and meaning to landscape photography as sites of constant energetic movement and change. Both feature explicit human intervention that block our most immediate impulse to consider landscape as only unmediated view of an expanse of environment. These images invite the viewer to consider how landscape photography offers a composed perception of the natural world, and how such images come to be processed by the viewer. Ideas about nature, art, and the photographic practice inextricably combine in landscape photography, and demonstrate a variety of ideologies, aesthetic concerns, and human preoccupations with the relationship to the environment. The inclusion or exclusion of the human figure, the choice of framing, and the treatment of aspects of the phenomenological world all factor as often unconscious presuppositions when considering landscape imagery. While Klett and Fall's photographs offer tantalizing possibilities towards the reconsideration of landscape, they are also only part of the larger show that I wish to highlight. How do we move from the Claudian landscape to the physically reconstituted landscape? How might we reconsider both the ways we alter land and the way land alters us in and as a photographic representation? Liz Wells reminds us, quote, "Landscape is a social product. Particular landscapes tell us something about cultural histories and attitudes. Landscape results from human intervention to shape or transform natural phenomena, of which we are simultaneously a part." End quote. As such, I wish to highlight a few more works briefly to expand an understanding of landscape that involves cultural histories, attitudes, interventions, and the transformation of natural phenomena. Janine Mishna-Bales's photographs explore the sometimes fraught relationship between the past and the present, and thus offer a crucial example of landscape as cultural history. The photograph Eagle Hollow Print is part of a larger body of work entitled Through Darkness to Light, Photographs Along the Underground Railroad, and was created over more than a decade. Mishna-Bales conducted fastidious research and traveled from Canada to Louisiana to make the unseen seen in her photographs of both documented and undocumented stops and routes along the Underground Railroad. Forests and swamps, as well as plantations and safe houses, all feature as part of the landscape that those desperate for freedom could have encountered as they traversed paths encompassing roughly 1,400 miles. As noted on Mishna-Bales's website documenting these sites, quote, "Those who made the journey would cover as many miles as possible each night, with little to no control over the natural barriers they would be forced to cross." End quote. In Eagle Hollow Print, with its moonlit grove of tangled trees, compels us to consider the full scope of what freedom seekers would have encountered, and in this way, the shift from the picturesque to sublime, and the move from a leisurely purview to a threatening encounter. The very darkness and difficult navigation of the picture plane of the photograph forces the beholder to consider how, in person, one might navigate such a space, and under what dire conditions. Kim Stringfellow's photograph, Abandoned Trailer, features as part of a larger project called Greetings from the Salton Sea, documenting the natural and built environment of the Salton Sea, an ecologically challenged inland body of water located in Southern California near the Mexican border. LA Times reporter Leah Ullman, in writing about the debut of these images in 2005, explains, quote, "The Salton Sea is California's Pompeii, a mythic and wondrous disaster. Historians trace its beginnings back to the creation flood of 1905, an accident of culture and nature alike, which humans aggressively exploited, determined to make a profit." End quote. Stringfellow herself describes the Salton Sea as, quote, "a study of contrasts, a compendium of the unexpected and ephemeral," end quote. The photograph Abandoned Trailer makes the point stunningly. Its subject, an oxidized, encrusted metal shell, sits sunken in a broad pool of liquid rust, the water's edges salty and crystalline. Green buzzes against orange, the sky's sharp, clean blue putting a cap on the friction. The sublime and surreal beauty that captivated Stringfellow has pungent origins. Brine and bacteria in the water, industrial and agricultural runoff, have made the sea an ecological mutant, littered with corroded debris. This version of landscape highlights how we are fascinated, even while terrified, of our own human impact on the land, and how photographing the destruction in such a way serves as both a beautiful and aesthetic function, as well as a cautionary tale. Bridget Murphy Milligan's digital collages combine photographs taken while traveling in Ireland with scanned drawings, paintings, and pages from antique storybooks. This photograph, Wren Day, features as part of a larger body of work entitled Fireside Tales, a convergence of fact and fiction, which juxtaposes the world of factual representation of ruins, monastic sites, rocks, and fields, along with the fantastical tales such spaces inspired, transforming space into place through photographic representation. The shadows, simple renderings of animals or figures representing stock characters and common archetypes in Irish folklore, twist reality into a fantasy. They transport the images into a reimagined existence, transparent silhouettes of the real, fading in and out of being like ghosts or memories. Turning flat images into sculptural objects, Letha Wilson's photographs in relief and site-specific installations draw attention to the relationship between architecture and nature. Shots of American landscapes are cut and folded like an accordion into wall-hung pieces, whose cavities and slashes offer physical interventions to the two-dimensional photographic plane. Such physical manipulation reminds us that all photographic landscape is manipulated to an extent, and offers a commentary on how we shape landscape as an aesthetic process. The subject of Lupita Murillo Tinnin's work for the last 2 decades has been the Mexican immigrant and undocumented community in the United States. In this, the final work of the show, Tinnin addresses landscape as map, offering a provocative statement about the conditions of those crossing the treacherous U.S. border, as well as another possibility of how to consider landscape. In this photograph, Tynan, like Mishnah Bales, emphasizes the darkness and precariousness of the route taken by those in search of a better life, while marking their path with thorns that make an allusion to Christ-like self-sacrifice. In her statement about this piece, Tynan explains, quote, "My goal for the artwork is to give back a sense of humanity to the thousands of people who died in search of a better life. I want to dedicate my artwork to all the people who have perished while traversing the desert and the men, women, and children whose bodies remain unclaimed in unmarked graves." It is my hope that throughout this talk, I have empowered you to question your most immediate impulse to consider landscape as only an unmediated view of an expansive environment. These photographic images invite the viewer to consider how landscape photography offers a composed perception of the natural world, and how such images come to be processed by the viewer. Ideas about nature, art, and the photographic practice inextricably combine in landscape photography and demonstrate a variety of ideologies, aesthetic concerns, and human preoccupations with our relationship to the environment. The inclusion or exclusion of the human figure, the choice of framing, and the treatment of aspects of the phenomenological world all factor as often unconscious presuppositions when considering landscape imagery. I invite you to consider the rest of the collection of photographs in this exhibit in terms of how the depiction of nature results from a conscious composition by the photographer and maker, and what you, as a viewer, bring to these images in the relationship as part of the aesthetic process. Thank you.